Hi, let me show you some of our holiday snaps. We took them when we were doing our best walk ever. That's Lake Louise in the Canadian Rockies. We started walking by the hotel at the end of the lake. We went quite a way, up to the foot of a glacier spilling off the Rockies. It wasn't that difficult though, because there were 2 Victorian tea houses on the way. We needed quite a few breaks. I was sitting there looking down at the lake when I heard a trombone playing somewhere down there on the lake. Yes, it was a trombone, but I couldn't see it. After the walk, I often thought about the idea of a trombone taking a boat trip. But why? The mystery wasn't solved until our return visit a couple of years later. It wasn't a trombone, and it wasn't in a boat. There it is. That's an alpine horn. An alpine horn. It sounds a lot like a trombone. That one's being played in front of the Lake Louise Hotel for the benefit of tourists. I've never been a tourist, of course. I'd been convinced that the sound came from the lake, and in a sense it did. That's because sound travels rather well over calm water and can bounce off it. The sound carries a long way and it reaches out in all directions. I heard it half a mile away on the mountainside, as clear as a bell. I was reading the 3rd chapter of Mark, and pictures of that walk began to flash through my mind. The chapter reminded me of hearing sounds over water. You might start to see why when I read the passage. Sounds over water. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and the large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him, to keep the people from crowding him. For he'd healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. There was a huge crowd, and he wanted to take the opportunity to preach to them. They'd come to get healed, or just to rubberneck at this phenomenon from Galilee, but it was time to preach. At least that's what I think he did. I think he preached from the boat. Only 25 verses later, at the beginning of chapter 4, we definitely do find him preaching from a boat to a huge crowd, and not for the first time. On that occasion, he used the boat to preach the simple message of the parable of the sower. Why did he use a boat? It was so that he could reach many more people. They needed to hear his message, so Jesus preached from a boat. He didn't have a voice like a trombone, but no worries, his voice could reach out far and wide across the water to the crowds gathered on the shore. They heard him as well as I heard the alpenhorn. I wonder if this was one of the reasons why Jesus chose a bunch of fishermen as his first disciples. They had boats, and boats were useful for preaching as well as for travelling. He preached to a great crowd, and some of them had come a very long way. Look, Jesus was there by the Red Star. We read that many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, the regions across the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon, far and wide, About the furthest point was Beersheba. These days you can drive from Beersheba to Capernaum in about 2.5 hours. That's averaging 60 miles an hour. But in Jesus' time it was more like 4 miles an hour on foot or with a donkey, say 5 days with overnight stops. Lots of people making an effort to get there. Why? It's often useful to ask why or what or how. Let's do some of that. Why did they make the effort to come some distance to Jesus? Mark tells us it's because of what they'd heard Jesus was doing. What had he done? We've already learned in Mark's Gospel that he'd healed a blind man, a leper, a paralysed man, and a withered hand. No mean feat. Some of that is still impossible today. And he cast out evil spirits who had proclaimed his divinity to all around. He'd even bested those hypocritical Pharisees. For some, the most intriguing thing was that he'd proved he could forgive sins. They wanted to see and to meet the man who'd done all this. How had they heard about all this? Obviously, there were people travelling about the country who'd seen what Jesus was doing and were impressed enough to spread the word around. And that might be a lesson for us too. We've seen what Jesus can do. We've seen that he does great things. We know what he's done for us or for others. So, are we willing to share that good news with other people, as did those who spread the word of what was happening in Galilee? These days there are crowds far bigger than those on the shore of Lake Galilee. Crowds that need to meet Jesus and hear what he's got to say. They might just be curious, or they may need healing, but whatever attracts them in the first place, they need to hear what Jesus has to say to them. And they need to hear it personally, not second-hand. We can introduce them to Jesus as a starting point. We can recommend him by what we've seen him do. Introductions are a one-to-one thing. No need to stand in a boat or in a pulpit or on a platform to make the introductions. It's one-to-one as opportunities present themselves, as happened to the people who travelled to Judea, to Jerusalem, to Idumea, and to the rest of the kingdom. So, Lord, please make us aware of the opportunities that present themselves to us, the opportunities to witness to you, and give us the words we need to introduce you to people and to introduce what you have done, perhaps just to whet their appetites, Lord. We ask for your help. Amen.